The time is just gone 11 minutes past 8 as we kick off this morning, taking a look at the Russian president who will not be attending the BRICS Summit in South Africa next month. And this has come through officially according to the country's presidency. To unpack, we're going now to senior researcher, Africa in the World Institute for Strategic Studies, Priyal Singh. Priyal, good morning to you. Welcome, and we appreciate your time.
Good morning. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, Priyal, it's official. The announcement has come through. Vladimir Putin will not be attending physically the BRICS summit, and any attempt to arrest Vladimir Putin, we've heard also, would be a declaration of war against Russia. Now, these are obviously strong sentiments that have been expressed, and a lot has actually taken place in the build up to the summit, and particularly under the radar or in the spotlight has been Vladimir Putin.
Absolutely. I think this is welcome news simply because it removes South Africa from a very, very difficult and potentially quite an embarrassing situation if the Russian president were to come to South Africa. The South African government would be placed in quite an impossible situation in which we have quite a clear, unambiguous legal framework in which South Africa has to fulfill its domestic and legal and international legal obligations under the ICC, under the Rome Statutes. But on the other hand, practically, to arrest the Russian president during an incredibly charged geopolitical moment such as this would certainly have been seen as yes, as you put it, and statements of war, the statements of intent. So it was quite an impossible situation for South Africa, and I do think we should applaud the good work done by DIRCO, done by the presidency behind the scenes to maneuver out of the situation. Because this is probably the best outcome in South Africa trying to maneuver itself through this dilemma that it currently faces.
Yes, and obviously, we're looking at South Africa trading some sort of a middle ground, and caught between a rock and a hard place, for want of a better term, considering the geopolitical issues that have been playing out, the tensions that have been playing out, but also at the same time in terms of how South Africa has positioned itself and how South Africa has actually been seen internationally.
Absolutely. All of this boils down to whether South Africa is seen as a responsible, capable, and committed international stakeholder that is willing to make good and is willing to uphold its responsibilities on the international stage in line with its international legal obligations and commitments. And I think something we should remember is that in December last year, at the ANC's 55th elective conference, a very clear resolution was taken by the ANC to rescind its long-standing proposal to withdraw from the ICC. And this was justified based on the fact that the ANC viewed that the ICC had reformed, had changed enough that the ANC and that South Africa was therefore comfortable with rescinding that proposal. And in December last year, South Africa essentially recommitted itself back to the ICC, recommitted itself to its existing legal obligations. And then just a few months after that, we see this arrest warrant being issued for the Russian president. And for South Africa to then backtrack again, I don't think would have been seen very positively or favorably by many international partners. That being said, we should always remain cognizant of the fact that there is certainly grounds for us to remain skeptical of some of the double standards and hypocrisy in the ways in which the ICC has gone about its business. We should certainly be engaged in a broader, long-standing debate around how these multilateral institutions function. South Africa, I think, has a very important role to play in walking this middle ground between East and West, between emerging powers and the global North.
Well, obviously, Priyal, there's every reason, and from what you are saying, that to remain skeptical with regard to organizations or forums like the ICC, because we've seen the discriminatory nature of the ICC in terms of how the global South is treated, and we've seen it in the past. We've seen it with people like Tony Blair, for instance. Iraq, Tony Blair also came to South Africa. There were crimes against humanity in terms of his involvement, the lies with regard to Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. And again, this whole question of selective treatment by the ICC. And this is problematic. But again, coming back to South Africa in terms of evaluating our position as far as international obligations are concerned, we are a full member of the ICC. We subscribe to things like the Rome Statute as well. But again, when one looks at the pressure that is being put internationally, particularly against the global South.
Absolutely. The fundamental problem with the ICC is the fact that many of the world's most powerful countries are simply not signatories to the ICC. Even if we had to look at the BRICS grouping, South Africa and Brazil really stand alone within that grouping in terms of their commitments to the ICC. That being said, for middle powers and for emerging powers like South Africa, I think there is an important role for us to play in trying to, develop or champion a fairer, more equitable and just international order. And the general idea surrounding the ICC is a good one. We do need a form of global legal governance in which all states can have recourse to. But the fact remains the world's most powerful countries, who often abuse their dominant positions in the international system, are simply not signatories to this. And this creates a very unlevel, unequal playing field. So South Africa should try and work with the system, but also remain skeptical and put pressure on other countries to sign up to this, to look at the ways in which the ICC functions so that we don't get this kind of politicization of very critical legal instruments that we need in the international system to create a more level and just playing field for all countries.
Priya, where does this actually leave the summit? Because it is a major event that is taking place. It means a lot for South Africa, and just looking at BRICS in itself, the summit itself, in terms of what is planned for the summit, the outcomes, and also that the physical absence of someone like Vladimir Putin at the summit, although we've learned that he will be attending virtually and participating fully at the summit.
Look, I think this is a positive outcome for the summits, simply because it removes the kind of sideshow politics that would have surrounded Putin's presence and arrival. This places firmly the substantive discussions of the summit in center stage, basically. So we're going to be focusing on issues looking at the expansion of the BRICS grouping. We're going to be looking at issues surrounding how the BRICS grouping can better interact and facilitate Africa's broader collective developmental interests and aspirations on the world stage. And I think it's also important for us to remember that just next week, we have the Russia Africa summit that will be taking place in St. Petersburg prior to the BRICS summits that will be taking place next month. So a lot of these issues, I think, go hand in hand. South Africa has a very packed diplomatic schedule this calendar this year. We have the Russia Africa summit next week, the BRICS summits after that. We have the G20. We have the AGOA renewal discussions with the US later on this year, and not forgetting all of this, the standing multilateral appointments and engagements for South Africa. So I think this is a good outcome because we can focus purely on the substance of the meeting. Russia, of course, will be represented by the foreign minister. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe that the Russian president will be joining virtually for some one or two of the sessions, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Now, obviously, all these forums that you are speaking about, whether we're talking about the G20, whether we're talking AGOA, all of them somehow are interrelated, and central to this has been Putin and the conflict that has been playing out between Russia and the Ukraine. But also at the same time, we are, and you made mention of this, that there are interested parties in joining BRICS. And the indications are very, very strong that at some point in time they will form part of this forum, and just moving away from the neoliberal element, a dominant element that has obviously been calling the shots, for want of a better term, for a very, very long time. And clearly, Putin is just one excuse, possibly. But when one looks at the global north, are they being threatened by a forum like BRICS, and possibly even looking at some of the outcomes that may emerge out of the summit?
Yes, certainly. I think we BRICS is still a very nascent kind of embryonic stage of development in challenging the dominance of the global South. There's still a long way to go, especially as this relates to issues surrounding expansion of the grouping with respect to other African countries or other states from the Middle East and Asia and so on. But certainly, BRICS represents a promising alternative pole in the international order to challenge the dominance of certain players in the global north. So I think that's an important consideration. Other factors relating to de-dollarization and those types of issues, again, I think are very much centered around uh, pursuing a more multipolar world order and challenging the dominance of the West and countries in the global north. So certainly BRICS does represent that. Um, I think what is going to be a key challenge, however, is for all countries within this grouping to have an equal say in determining the overall agenda of how we will move towards a more multipolar world order and exactly what that multipolar world order should or could look like. This shouldn't simply just be left to Beijing or Moscow or New Delhi to set the agenda. We need a much more kind of collective effort amongst a broader constellation of states from the global south in determining that agenda.
Yes, and also, Priyal, while the focus is on Putin, one cannot forget China, one cannot ignore India, because simply if we play the numbers games, these two countries represent a massive, a huge a number of the world population. So, in terms of representation, we're talking about five nations, but in terms of representation, they represent a lot. And China will always remain a factor. China will always remain a major player, and we know what has been playing out between China, the United States of America, even during the Trump era. So this is one factor that one cannot ignore.
Absolutely. I mean, this is, close to them. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the majority of the world's population, or close to it, if I can say that. This represents a major political bloc. But it's important for us to remember right now that BRICS is not a formal intergovernmental organization with a secretariat, with a charter, with rules of operation and procedure, and so on. BRICS remains an informal, what we would often refer to as a diplomatic club, something similar to the G20, for example, as opposed to the AU or the UN. So I think, for states to really make good on this promise of pursuing or actively pursuing a more multipolar world order, advancing their interests amongst countries in the global south and so on, and challenging the dominance of the global north, we should be moving towards some greater form of formalization, of institutionalization of BRICS and other groupings. But this also raises the important question of the internal coherence amongst states within the BRICS grouping. I'm sure your listeners will be aware of certain tensions that exist between India, between China, even between China and Russia to some extent on various issues. So I think working around those issues towards some form of a greater formalization could be something that these countries would want to pursue over the next 5 years, over the next decade, and so on.
Yes, in fact, I just see there's a comment that has come through, Priyal, before we take leave of you. David Damson Tambo says, why do the powers that be possibly charge those involved with the Libyan and Iraqi issues? And again, we were talking about the selective nature of the ICC.
Exactly, and this comment is very appropriate because it really speaks to the heart of the issue here, and that is the politicization of instruments like the ICC. Once these bodies are seen to be politicized or instrumentalized for the interests of a few, and not applying an equal standard to all countries, essentially the credibility and the legitimacy of these institutions are undermined. And then we just don't have a working, functioning institution. And countries will not respect those institutions. So I think it's in the interest of all states, even countries who are not signatories to the ICC, um, to address these issues, to address these perceptions of double standards, at least. Even if they don't agree that there are double standards, they must at least acknowledge that there are very strong perceptions of double standards and hypocrisy that exist, especially amongst countries in the global south, especially amongst countries that have been at the receiving end of the abuses of power by powerful countries in the global north.
Well, Priyal, thank you very much for that. And as always, we do appreciate your time with us this morning. Please take care.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
Priyal Singh with the Institute for Strategic Studies with us this morning. And we're going to go for a quick break. We come back, we'll be joined by Mariette Lieferink. We're talking about the gas explosion that took place in Johannesburg yesterday.